The anatomy of an introduction. Your introduction plays a critical role in the success of your paper. However, many students struggle when writing an introduction because they're unfamiliar with what the core components should be, how they should be sequenced, and how they should be linked. This video provides insights into each of those concerns so that you can write an effective introduction. What is the purpose of an introduction? Ideally, there are three components that your introduction should have. First, it should establish the scope of the paper. That doesn't simply mean your broad topic, but the narrow framework in which you're going to discuss it. Then, you'll outline the evidence you're going to discuss, ideally in the order that it appears in the paper. And finally, you'll establish your position or argument. In this way, the introduction serves as a roadmap for the paper. Imagine your readers setting out on a journey. Without clear instruction from you, they'll likely get lost and end up at a dead end. However, when you set out clear instruction at the outset of the essay, the reader will know two things: what your goal is and how you plan on arriving at your goal. With these two things in hand, they can easily follow your argument through to its conclusion. There are three key components to your introduction. The first is your hook, which should be an engaging line that establishes your topic and elicits the reader's interest. This is followed by an outline of your evidence, and then finally a thesis statement. The hook is a nuanced process, and there's many different options that you can use to grab your reader's attention. To this end, we have created a video specifically to outline all the different options and how you can use them effectively. Likewise, the thesis is a multi-step process. Therefore, we've also created a separate video that explains how to write an effective thesis. If you want more information on these two topics, be sure to watch those videos as well. Special note: as mentioned, it's critical that the evidence you outline in your introduction appears in the same sequence or order that it will appear throughout your paper. This makes it easy for your reader to follow and anticipate the information that you're going to be providing them with. How does this work in practice? Let's assume that you've been tasked with writing an essay on whether or not pop culture should be included in academia. In this context, you would have already done your research beforehand and established the sequence of your ideas. In this case, you might start by noting that pop culture can increase student engagement. Likewise, it can promote critical literacy skills. And finally, it can help simplify complex ideas. How are we going to sequence them in the introduction? We'll begin with the hook. In this case, we'll put together two contrasting positions to create tension, grab the reader's interest, and give the reader a sense of the argument that we're going to be exploring. Some suggest that pop culture has no place in academia. However, others suggest that it has benefits. From here, we'll want to use a transition to segue into the outline of the evidence. In this case, we might also give the reader a sense of the argument that we're going to be establishing. There are a few pieces of evidence that support the latter position. Once we have created an engaging hook, we want to outline the evidence that we'll be discussing throughout the rest of the essay. When we do this, we want to use effective transition words so that the reader will understand how each idea relates to each other. Evidence 1. For example, including pop culture can increase student engagement. In this case, we begin with "for example," an introductory element that establishes that this is the first piece of evidence. Evidence 2. It can also promote students' information literacy. In this case, we've used the adverb "also." Although this is in the sentence rather than at the beginning, the reader is still given an indication that this idea is an additional idea that's being added to the one before it. Evidence 3. Finally, it can help simplify complex academic concepts. In this case, we've used the adverb "finally" to show the reader that this is an additional, but also the final idea that we're going to be discussing. Now that we have a hook and an outline of the evidence, it's time to introduce our thesis statement. A critical review of these benefits demonstrates that teachers in post-secondary schools should include pop culture in their courses to increase engagement and promote student outcomes. Now the reader will have a clear sense of what your essay aims to prove. Let's use another example. Perhaps you're a human kinetics major and you've been asked to write an essay that explores whether or not college athletes in the NCAA should be paid. Again, before you begin writing, you will already have an understanding of your key points and the sequence they go in. In this case, you might begin by discussing the amount of revenue that the NCAA generates each year. You might then discuss the fact that athletes put themselves at the risk of injury and also risk their future earnings. And finally, you might conclude by discussing the ethics of the conversation. We'll begin with a hook. In this case, we might use a rhetorical question to encourage the reader to think about the position. Should NCAA athletes be paid? Again, before entering the outline of the evidence, we want to use a transition that gives a reader a sense of the position that we hold. Several factors suggest that they should. Now we're ready to outline our evidence. Keep in mind, we still want to use effective transitions to show the reader how the ideas and evidence relate to each other. Evidence 1. For instance, the NCAA generates over $1 billion annually from athletes' work. In this case, we use the introductory element, for instance. This shows that this is the first example. Evidence 2. Likewise, athletes risk their health and potential future earnings. In this case, we've used likewise to show the reader that this idea is similar to and building on the idea before it. Evidence 3. Lastly, it is unethical to not pay people for their work. Lastly is an adverb that shows the reader this is the final idea. Now the reader knows that the outline of evidence is complete. Now that we have an engaging hook and a clear outline of our evidence, it's time to introduce our thesis statement. An analysis of these considerations suggests that collegiate athletes should be paid. Now your reader has a clear understanding of exactly what you aim to prove throughout your essay. Let's do one final example. In this case, you're a psychology major who has been asked to write an essay that outlines the best treatment options for a psychological disorder of your choosing. In this case, we'll assume that you've selected depression. The first treatment option that you're going to discuss is pharmacological treatments or medication. You'll follow this up by discussing psychotherapy approaches and then conclude by outlining some psychopharmacological approaches. We'll begin with a hook. In this case, we'll use a statistic that shows the prevalence of the issue. This will elicit the reader's interest because it will show them how important it is. Over 80% of Canadians will struggle with depression at some point in their lives. From here, we want to use a transition. Given how prevalent the issue is, it is critical to identify the most effective treatments. Now the reader understands that the goal of your essay is to establish which treatments are most effective. Now we're ready to outline our evidence. Evidence 1. Some studies have outlined the merits and demerits of pharmacological treatments. Here, rather than using a traditional transition, we've used an adjective, some, to allude to the fact that there are other studies that will be discussed. Evidence 2. However, other research has highlighted the benefits of psychotherapy. Here, we've used the adverb however as an introductory element. This shows that the second piece of evidence is in contrast to the first. Evidence 3. Still others advocate for psychopharmacological approaches. Still others alludes to other research, and now the reader knows the 3 different treatment options that you'll be discussing. Now that we've outlined the options that you're going to be discussing, it's time for your thesis statement. A comparison of each method suggests that psychopharmacological approaches are often most effective, but that healthcare professionals need to consider all 3 options on a case-by-case basis. Now the reader will have a clear understanding of exactly what you seek to prove throughout the course of your essay. In summary, there are 3 core components to the introduction: the hook, the outline of the evidence, and your thesis statement. Keep in mind, there are many options for the hook, so watch our video on how to create an effective hook. Likewise, the thesis is a multi-step process that's very nuanced. Watch our video on how to construct an effective thesis as well. With those in hand, you'll be able to write an effective and engaging introduction. Now it's time for some final thoughts. First, be sure to use a hook that suits your paper. There are many different options out there, but not every hook works equally well with every topic. 2. Sequence the evidence in the same order that it appears in your paper. This is critical because it allows your reader to understand the direction that you're going in. 3. Use appropriate transitions to move from one piece of evidence to the next. This way, the reader will be able to understand how each piece of evidence relates to each other. And finally, make sure you have a clear thesis statement to close out your introduction. Without this, even if you have good research and even if you have great analysis, the reader won't be able to understand what you're trying to prove, and this could significantly inhibit your grade. If you have any other questions or need any help applying these strategies to your paper, be sure to book an appointment with the Writing Support Desk through My Success. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.